Our next film is the controversial The Last Temptation of Christ. And I almost want to say to everybody, you've heard the protest, now see the movie. Because it is quite extraordinary. A film that truly generated a religious experience within me, portraying a more human Jesus, one who trembles at God's calling, and yet manages, to his own amazement, at times, to spread the message of love, as in this scene where he speaks up for the right of the prostitute Mary Magdalene to attend a wedding.
You don't belong at a wedding. We're here to celebrate purity.
I'm sorry, but these people are my guests.
Please. Let me explain something to you. What do you think heaven's like? It's like a wedding. God's the bridegroom, and man's spirit's the bride. The wedding takes place in heaven, and everyone's invited. God's world is big enough for everybody.
Nazarene, that's against the law.
Then the law is against my heart.
That's Willem Dafoe, the good sergeant from Platoon, quite effective as Jesus, a difficult role to play, to say the least. Here he is, railing against the money changers, soiling the spirit of the temple. That coin image stays in our mind. What is money really worth? As does the simple image of Jesus carrying the cross. This Jesus is more than a standard misunderstood God we see in most biblical films. This Jesus knows that it is harder to be a good man than to be God. The Last Temptation of Christ was masterfully directed by Martin Scorsese from Paul Schrader's script of the equally controversial novel by Nikos Kazantzakis, who came up with the idea of accenting the human, doubting quality of Jesus. The effect, at least on me, was not to trash Jesus, but rather to make his message more accessible. For if he has doubts and fears, we can be more comfortable with our own. It's a very simple construction, and it works beautifully. If he can resist some temptation after really struggling with it, maybe we can too, rather than the thunderbolt kind of Lord that is presented in most biblical films. The Last Temptation of Christ thus becomes a magnificent story of challenge and of hope.
You know, Gene, you said you had a religious experience when you saw this film,
and I did
too. This movie made me think more deeply and more seriously, and for a longer time, I'm still thinking about it,
Yes.
about the mystery of the fact that Jesus was both God and man, at least within the Christian teaching, that's what he was, than any other film I've ever seen, or at any other time in my life. Did I really confront that he was God and he was man. He had all of the weaknesses of man, as well as all of the strength of God. And this movie is a devout movie that does Jesus the compliment of taking him more seriously than any other movie ever made. So that it's an ironic, I think, contradiction that people who worship Jesus and who haven't seen the film are attacking this film, which is actually more of a religious experience than any other movie that they could think of about Jesus.
The controversy is quite silly. I mean, people can have their objections based on what they've seen, of course, but if they haven't seen it, I mean, it's just so silly.
If God had wanted, God had a lot of choices in terms of sending his word down to man. He could have sent us all a letter in the mail, you know, or telepathically informed us of everything. He sent his son because he wanted to do that as a symbol, as a story that we could then read and learn from in terms of the fact that he so loved man that he made his only begotten son into a man. So therefore, that kind of story is a story that needs to be retold and reinterpreted for every generation in terms of the symbolism that God was trying to put into it. That's why this movie is so valid.
This is a special film.
It's a good movie. 2 thumbs up for The Last Temptation of Christ by Martin Scorsese, a movie that made us both think long and seriously about God and man.